Medellin, March 14, 1989, 06:12 a.m. The office lights were still off when he arrived. The city outside was only beginning to stir, engines starting, radios turning on, footsteps echoing faintly through concrete corridors. Inside the building, everything was still. He placed the envelope on the desk without ceremony, as if it had been there all along. No one asked where it came from. No one asked why it was delivered so early. Silence wasn't politeness. It was recognition. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have. Each second landed with intention. Whoever had walked into that room believed time was on his side. He believed the hardest part was already behind him. He was wrong. Across town, 3 men waited inside a parked car with the engine running. They weren't nervous. They were confident. The dangerous kind. One of them kept checking his watch, already planning how the day would unfold once the message was received. He had rehearsed the conversation in his head, imagined relief spreading across faces when the situation was resolved. He didn't understand that no resolution was coming. At 06:19, a phone rang in a different neighborhood. It rang longer than necessary. The delay was deliberate. When the call was finally answered, no names were exchanged. None were needed. The voice on the line spoke calmly, almost casually, as if confirming something that had already been decided days earlier. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. That morning, rumors were circulating through Medellin faster than traffic. Newspapers hinted at internal fractures. Government officials whispered about betrayals. Money was stuck. Routes were compromised. Allies were asking questions they shouldn't have been asking. To most people, the situation looked unstable. To Pablo Escobar, it looked orderly. He had seen this pattern before. Always the same sequence. Pressure from the outside, anxiety on the inside, and somewhere in between, a man who believed proximity meant protection. Someone close enough to think the rules bent for him. Someone who mistook access for immunity. The envelope on the desk wasn't thick. It didn't need to be. Its weight wasn't measured in cash, but in assumption. Whoever handed it over believed it closed a chapter, that it compensated for risk, that it balanced the scale. It didn't. By 06:34, word began to move, quietly. Not through phone calls, not through meetings, through absence. A door that remained closed. A message that wasn't returned. A routine that didn't resume. People noticed these things instinctively, even if they couldn't explain why they mattered. The man who had taken the money was already awake. He was calm, too calm, sitting at a small kitchen table, coffee untouched, listening to the radio without hearing a word. He had told himself that once the envelope changed hands, everything would slow down, that the tension would dissolve, that he had bought himself time. Time was the one thing he had just run out of. He replayed recent conversations in his head, searching for missteps. There were none, at least none that seemed obvious. He hadn't spoken too much. He hadn't threatened anyone. He hadn't acted impulsively. In his mind, he had been careful, strategic, rational. What he failed to understand was that the system he served didn't punish recklessness. It punished deviation. Loyalty, in Escobar's world, wasn't emotional. It was structural. You didn't earn it with words. You maintained it by staying exactly where you were placed. The moment you tried to move yourself, even slightly, you became visible. And visibility was fatal. By mid-morning, small adjustments were already taking place across the city. A scheduled meeting was postponed without explanation. A shipment was rerouted with no follow-up. An intermediary suddenly found himself waiting for approval that never came. None of these actions seemed dramatic on their own. Together they formed a pattern, a vacuum. The man closest to Escobar felt it before he understood it. Calls stopped connecting. Familiar faces became distant. Even the air around him felt heavier, charged with something he couldn't name. He tried to convince himself it was paranoia, that everyone was simply being cautious. At 10:07 a.m., someone knocked on his door. It wasn't aggressive. No raised voices, no weapons in sight. Just 2 men standing calmly, dressed plainly, faces neutral. They didn't rush him. They didn't threaten him. One of them simply asked if he was ready. Ready for what was never clarified. The car ride was quiet. Too quiet. No music. No conversation. The city passed by outside the window as if nothing unusual was happening. Vendors set up stalls. Children walked to school. Life continued uninterrupted. That was the most unsettling part. He tried to speak once. Just once. The words felt wrong the moment they left his mouth. One of the men in the front seat raised a hand gently, signaling that there was no need to continue. The message was clear. This wasn't a negotiation. Somewhere else in Medellin, Pablo Escobar was reviewing reports. Not about this situation specifically, about everything. He didn't need updates on individual outcomes. Outcomes were automatic once the input changed. He focused on the structure, not the noise. When someone mentioned the envelope, he didn't react. No anger, no satisfaction, just acknowledgement, as if confirming that gravity was still working. By early afternoon, the man who thought he had escaped consequence was gone. Not publicly, not dramatically, simply removed from the system, the way a malfunctioning part is replaced without ceremony. People noticed, but no one asked questions. They already knew the answer. The city adjusted. Fear didn't spike. It settled, organized itself, found its proper place again. The absence of chaos was the real signal. Order had been restored without a single public display of force. And that was the point. No announcement followed. No explanation was offered. By the next morning, the absence had already been absorbed into routine. People didn't ask where he went. They asked who would replace the space he left behind. That was the first lesson, quietly reinforced. The system did not pause for grief. In Medellin, information rarely moved in straight lines. It curved, bent, stalled, then arrived precisely where it needed to be. By noon, everyone who mattered understood the same thing without having to say it aloud. The envelope had not bought safety. It had revealed intention. Those closest to the center adjusted their behavior immediately. Meetings became shorter. Words became fewer. Decisions that had once been debated were now accepted without friction. The city didn't feel tense. It felt aligned. Pablo Escobar didn't issue a directive. He didn't need to. His power didn't operate through commands, but through predictability. People knew what the structure required because it had never contradicted itself. When lines were crossed, the response was not emotional. It was procedural. That consistency was the real deterrent. Somewhere in a government office, a report was drafted and then quietly shelved. The language was softened. Names were removed. Recommendations became observations. The tone shifted from urgency to caution. Officials told themselves it was temporary, that they were buying time. They didn't realize time had already been redistributed. In neighborhoods that relied on Escobar's reach, daily life continued uninterrupted. Payments arrived as expected. Routes reopened. Debts were settled. The stability felt reassuring. People mistook it for mercy. It wasn't. It was efficiency. The message had not been sent to the public. It had been sent to those who mattered most. The ones close enough to believe they had leverage. The ones who had begun to think in terms of options. Options were a liability. Late that afternoon, a man who had known the missing figure for years paused mid-conversation. He realized he had been speaking too freely, not because anyone warned him, because the room felt different, quieter, the kind of quiet that recalibrates behavior. He stopped himself, nodded, and changed the subject. The correction was internal. That was how Escobar preferred it. Control worked best when it didn't announce itself. Across the city, small acts of self-censorship multiplied. Phones rang less often. Messages were shorter. Plans were simplified. People weren't scared. They were focused. Fear scattered attention. Focus consolidated it. By evening, the absence had transformed into a reference point. Not spoken, but understood. A reminder embedded into routine. When someone hesitated before making a move, they weren't thinking about violence. They were thinking about sequence, about cause and effect. That was the real victory. Escobar spent that night doing nothing remarkable. He ate. He listened. He let reports come to him without interruption. He didn't ask follow-up questions. He didn't dwell on outcomes. Outcomes were inevitable once alignment was restored. What mattered was that the system had corrected itself without needing to escalate. No spectacle. No chaos. Just adjustment. Days later, a journalist would mention the missing man in passing, buried deep in an article about something else entirely. No investigation followed. No headline formed. The story lacked friction. It didn't catch. The silence held. Inside the organization, promotions happened quietly. Someone stepped into a role without ceremony. The criteria were never explained, but everyone understood them instantly. Reliability, position, obedience to structure, not loyalty. Loyalty implied choice. This was alignment. Weeks passed. The event faded from conscious thought, but not from behavior. It lived on in pauses, in restraint, in the subtle discipline that governs long-term power. Those who had once believed proximity granted privilege now understood the truth. Proximity increased responsibility. It narrowed margins. It removed ambiguity. The closer you were, the less room you had to improvise. The man who had taken the money had believed he was solving a problem. In reality, he had identified himself as one. That distinction mattered. In the months that followed, the state recalibrated its approach. Confrontations became symbolic. Deadlines became flexible. Pressure was applied at the edges, never at the center. Officials spoke of progress, while adjusting expectations downward. They called it pragmatism. Escobar called it confirmation. His power did not rely on unpredictability. It relied on the certainty that deviations would be addressed with precision. People didn't fear sudden explosions. They feared becoming irrelevant, removed, excluded from the flow. That fear was quieter, more durable. Years later, those who survived would struggle to explain how control felt so complete without constant violence. They would point to moments like this one, without fully understanding why it mattered. They would describe an atmosphere, a sense of order that punished misalignment before it became rebellion. They would miss the point. The point was that power, when properly structured, didn't need to react. It only needed to remain consistent. The envelope had never been the trigger. It was the confirmation. Proof that someone had misunderstood the rules while believing he had mastered them. The correction was inevitable. And it would happen again. Not in the same way. Not with the same names. But with the same logic. The same silence. The same outcome. Because systems don't forgive misunderstandings. They erase them.